Tardes, bienvenidos a nuestra
Okay, good afternoon, everyone.
tercera sesión
Welcome
del
to our
seminario
third session
sobre las
of
tecnologías
seminars
de
on
rastreo para
technologies,
estudiar la ecología de la migración.
on tracing technologies
Nosotros
for
somos el subcomité de
migration
ecología de la
ecology.
migración
We are the
dentro del
subcommittee
comité
of
científico
migration
de
ecology, and we are
compañeros en
part of the
vuelo. Y
scientific
para
committee
las
of Partners
personas
in Flight.
nuevas,
And for
compañeros en
those
vuelo es
of
una
you who are
red de
joining for the first
colaboradores
time,
que opera
Partners
en
in
el
Flight is a
continente
network of
americano desde
collaborators that
1990
operates in the American
para
continent since
preservar las aves.
1990 for
Después
bird
de mi
conservation.
introducción, les voy a dejar un
And
enlace
after this
para que
introduction, I'm going to
puedan
share with you a
aprender
link
más
so you can learn
sobre
more
compañeros en vuelo.
about Partners in
Um,
Flight.
Antes de comenzar con nuestro programa, tenemos
So
un par de
before kicking off
anuncios.
the program, we have
El
a couple
primer
of
anuncio
announcements
es
and
que
updates.
del
First
22 al
of all
25 de
is that
abril,
from April
el grupo de
22nd to
compañeros en
25th,
vuelo del oeste y el grupo de
our
trabajo del
group
oeste
of Partners in Flight's
va
Western
a
Working
sostener
Group
una
is
reunión.
going
Es
to
una
hold a
reunión
meeting.
híbrida
This is a
y es una
hybrid
reunión
meeting,
abierta. Entonces,
and it
si
is an
están
open meeting.
interesados en
So if you are
participar,
interested in
pueden hacerlo.
participating,
Amy
you are
McDonald les
welcome
va
to
a
do so.
compartir el
Amy
enlace.
McDonald will share
Y de
with you
interés
the link.
y de conexión con este subcomité es
And
también
along with
coordinar.
this
Va a haber una
subcommittee
sesión especial sobre Motus.
it's good to know that
Entonces,
there will
puede
be
ser
one
de
session
su
about
interés.
Motus
El segundo
on April
anuncio es
23rd.
que hemos estado
Second
trabajando en
update is
una
that we've been
hoja
working
de cálculo en donde
on
vamos a
a
poner información
spreadsheet where we're
sobre
going to share
opciones
information
de
about
colaboración, oportunidades
collaboration
de
options,
financiación para que
opportunities for
nuestra comunidad
funding, so
pueda
our
crecer.
community can
Y
continue
tenemos un
growing.
formulario que les vamos a
And we
compartir
have a
para
form that
obtener
we will also share with
retroalimentación y
you
así
so you can
mejorar
give us
esa
feedback
hoja.
and we can
¿Ves?
continue to
Fantástico.
improve
Y
these
el último
spreadsheets.
anuncio
So we're
es que
almost there.
nosotros nos
And
comunicamos
the
con
last
ustedes a
update
través
is that
de
we
un
communicate
listserv.
with you through
El emitente
listserv.
de este listserv es este
And
que
the
aparece
sender
aquí en la
is the
pantalla.
one that you can see on
Si
the
no
screen.
están
If you're
registrados,
not
pueden
registered,
unirse
you
utilizando
can
este
join
código
by
o
scanning this
enviándonos un
QR
mensaje.
code or sending us an email.
Y bueno, sin más, este
And
es el
well, without
programa del
further
día de hoy.
ado, this is the
Después de
agenda
estos
for today.
anuncios, ahora vamos a
After these
contar con
updates,
dos
now we're
presentaciones
going to
y luego con un tiempo
continue to the
para
next
discusión.
presentations.
Por
We are going
favor,
to have
ingresen
two
sus preguntas
presentations and then there
en la
will be
cajita
time
del
for discussion.
Q&A, pero
Please enter
también
your
siéntanse
questions in the
libres de
Q&A
comentar en
box,
el chat.
but if
Y
you
bueno, sin más,
prefer to
voy a dar
comment in the
paso
chat,
a
that
mi
is
colega y
okay too.
co-coordinadora de este
And
subcomité,
so
Amy
now
McDonald,
please
para
welcome
que
Amy
nos
McDonald
hable
so
sobre la primera
she
presentación.
can introduce us to the first
Muchas
presenter.
gracias, Fabi, y gracias a todos
Thank
por
you,
invitarme.
Fabi, and
Soy
thank you
Amy,
everyone
una de
for
las
joining
coordinadoras de la red Motus
here.
on Birds
I am
Canada,
Amy.
y
I'm
es
one
un
of the
placer
coordinator for the
presentarles a
Motus
Julián
Network in
García
Canada, and I'm very
para
happy to
hablarnos
introduce
de su
Julian
trabajo
Garcia, who is going to
implementando
talk
y
to us
usando la
about
red
his work
Motus en México.
in increasing
Julián
the
es un
Motus
biólogo
network in
mexicano con
Mexico.
más de
He's a
una
Mexican
década de
biologist, and he
experiencia
has
en la
over a decade of
conservación de
experience
humedales
in
costeros y la protección
conservation
de
of
aves
wetlands
migratorias en los
and
territorios
protection
del
of migratory
continente
birds
pacífico.
throughout the Pacific shoreline.
Dirige el Laboratorio de Aves de
He
Conexa
is the
Noreste en
director
Central
of
México
the
y
lab
está finalizando su
of the bird
doctorado
lab
en la
of
Universidad de
Pronatura, and he's
Massachusetts
finishing
Amherst.
his PhD in
Como
the University of
coordinador de la red
Massachusetts.
Motus en el
And
Noreste de
as Motus
México,
coordinator
aplica
in
la
the northwest
ecología del
area of
movimiento para
Mexico,
mejorar el
he
conocimiento
studies the
y la
ecology of
conservación de
movements
las
to improve
poblaciones de
knowledge
aves
and
en
conservation
México y más allá.
of the bird
Su charla
populations
se
in
titula
Mexico and
De una
beyond.
idea a una realidad,
The
rastreando lo
presentation
terrestre de
is
manera colaborativa en México
Tracing
y
a
más allá.
Reality in a
Muchas gracias por
collaborative way in
presentar, Julián,
Mexico
y
and
adelante
beyond. Thank
para
you
su
so much,
presentación
Julian,
más de
for being
preparación
here,
sobre
and thank you
Motus
for
y
sharing
aves
your knowledge
migratorias.
on Motus and migratory birds.
Muchas gracias, Amy. No sabía que hablabas español, así
Thank
que
you, Amy. I didn't
hablaremos en
know that you
español.
speak Spanish, so from now on our
Estoy
conversations
aprendiendo.
will be in
Muy
Spanish.
bien.
I'm
Good
learning.
afternoon to
Well, that's
everybody. I'm
great.
going to give my talk in Spanish, but we have a translator, and please let me know if I'm talking too fast. Okay. Okay. I'm going to share my screen. Okay.
Okay.
Bueno, muchas gracias a todos. Muchas gracias,
Thank you,
Amy, por la
everyone. Thank you,
presentación.
Amy, for that great
Muy bien.
introduction. And as she well mentioned, I am the director of the bird laboratory in Pronatura Northwest, and in a month exactly, I am going to be finishing my thesis, so I'm very happy about that.
Es un placer para mí contarles
It's my
sobre cómo
pleasure
logramos
to tell
colaborativamente
you
realizar
about
este
how
sueño
we were
de
able
una
to
realidad.
make this
Este
dream
sueño
into
siempre
a
fue
reality. This
mejorar
dream
el rastreo de
was
las vías
always
silvestres de
to
manejo
achieve
colaborativo desde
tracing
México hasta todo el
of or
resto de
tracking
humanos
of
a las
wildlife
especies migratorias de aves.
in Mexico, but also in all the places where
Y van a
these
escuchar que
species
cuando
of
hablo de
birds
Motus,
travel to.
hablo de
And when
nuestra
I talk about
colaboración,
Motus,
pero por eso
I
quiero
bring up
comenzar
the
pues
concept of
agradeciéndoles a
collaboration
todos
a lot.
aquellos que han
So I
sido
want to
parte de este
start by
proyecto, que nos
thanking
han guiado,
everyone that has
nos
been
han
part of this
ayudado a
project
llegar hasta el
and who have
éxito.
helped
Aquí a la
us
izquierda
to
pueden
achieve
ver que
success.
somos
To the
un gran
left, you
equipo
can see that we are a
de
very
Pronatura
small team,
Noroeste, con
Pronatura
Daniel y Luis
Northwest.
y a mi a la izquierda,
Here
pero
are
tenemos
Daniel
muchos
and Luis. I am
amigos,
on the left,
tanto
but
en
we have many,
México como en
many
la ruta
friends, both
migratoria, que nos han
in
ayudado
Mexico and
desde
along the
instalar estaciones
migratory flyway.
marcadas
They have
para
helped us
personas
to
y
set
también
up
proporcionar
station,
información y apoyo
banding,
conocimiento.
training
Entonces, muchas
people,
gracias
and
a
bringing
ellos.
support with knowledge and experience.
Y
So I
bueno,
want
quiero
to thank
empezar
all of them.
asumiendo
And
que
I
hay
want to
aquí
start
personas que tienen
assuming that
interés
we
en
have people here
unirse a
who
esta
are
iniciativa Motus y
interested
por ello
in
quisiera
joining
hacer
the
un poco de
Motus
contexto
network,
de qué es
and I'm going
Motus,
to give you a
cómo
little
funciona
context about
y
what
sobre todo
Motus
qué lo
is
hace
and how it
diferente a
works,
otras tecnologías
and
de rastreo.
why is this tracking technology different from
Y
the other
bueno,
ones.
Motus habrán escuchado, es
Motus,
una
maybe that
iniciativa
you've heard
internacional de
that this is an
científicos,
international initiative where scientists
conservacionistas están instalando
and people
estas
that work in
estaciones
conservation
de
are setting up these
radiotelemetría
stations
automatizadas. Y se
of
utilizan estos transmisores,
automated
son
radio
transmisores de radio,
transmitters.
se los ponemos a las
These
aves
transmitters
y
are
entonces
based on
la
radio,
idea es
and
que
we
cuando el
place them
ave
on the bird.
marcada viaja
So the
hacia esta
idea
cielo,
is that
pues
when the
estas
bird is
estaciones Motus
traveling,
pueden detectar sus
Motus
movimientos.
stations can
Estos
detect
transmisores
when
no
they
guardan la
fly by.
información, más
These
bien emiten
transmitters
señales de
do
radio.
not
Estas señales de
save
radio
the information.
pues pasan
They
por ejemplo, cada
produce
5
radio
segundos
signals
y están
every
codificadas 5 seconds,
seconds,
identificar a
and they are
cada ave en
codified to
individuo.
identify each individual.
Y la idea en general es que entre más estaciones
And the
Motus
idea is that the more
instalemos
stations
colaborativamente,
we set up
pues aumenta nuestra
in
capacidad de
collaboration, then we have
responder
a higher
preguntas y
capacity
hacer saber
to
datos
answer
hasta
questions
regional
at a
e
local
inclusive
level and at a
omnisciente.
regional
Toda
level
esta
and
riqueza
even
de
in the entire
datos que
hemisphere.
se
And this richness
colecta
of data that we
colaborativamente,
are able to
pues va a un
collect
repositorio centralizado que maneja
collaboratively,
BIRDS Canada
it
y
goes to
esto
a
nos da la
centralized
posibilidad de poder pues revisar estos
uh,
datos en tiempo real en
database,
nuestra
which is
computadora
handled
en
by
donde
Canada,
llevamos
and that
trabajando en
allows us
nuestra casa.
to access this data from our
Y
computers in our
bueno, ¿cómo
offices
es
or
Motus
at our
diferente a otras
homes.
tecnologías?
So, how
Pues la
is
primera
Motus
diferencia
different
para mí
from
de
other
esto es la
technologies?
colaboración.
To me, the
Pueden ver
best part is
que
collaboration.
este
Here
infograma
you can
nos muestra
see
que Motus está
that this
presente
infography
en 4
shows us that
continentes,
Motus
sobre
is
4
present in
países.
4 continents,
Hay más de
34
2.000
countries.
estaciones
We have
Motus
over
en el
2,000
mundo y
stations
pues
around the world,
colaborativamente hemos
and
platicado y aprendido mucho de
we have
Motus
been
en otros
able
países en los
to
50.000 y
to
más
learn
países. Y para mí lo
about
que me
over
impactó
400
hace varios
species
meses fue
and
esta animación
51,000
que hizo
individuals.
Ana
And what
González,
captured my attention was this
marcando a los
animation made
Swans
by
del
Ana
Park
González.
en Sudamérica.
Here
Pueden ver
they
que
were
gracias
tracing
a
the
que otras personas han
Swainson's
instalado estas
thrush from South
estaciones
America, and thanks to the
migratorias,
stations
hemos
that we
comenzado a
have
aprender
placed
sobre
along
dónde
the
están yendo
migratory
estas
flyway,
aves.
we can
Y para
learn
mí
where they
esto
go.
hace
And
algunos
to
años
me,
pues fue lo
a
que me
couple of
realmente
years
me
ago,
cautivó.
blew my mind. It was really caught my
La
attention.
segunda gran diferencia para mí
The
es el
second
peso,
biggest
¿no?
difference is the weight
Porque si bien
for me,
existen muchos tipos de
because
transmisores
we
allá
have
afuera,
many types of
muchos de estos
transmitters out
transmisores siguen
there,
siendo
but
demasiado pesados
most
para
of
algunas
them
especies
continue to be
y
too
Motus
heavy
utiliza
for some
transmisores que
species,
vienen siendo
and Motus
súper
uses
ligeros. Algunos
transmitters
de
that
ellos
are super
pesan lo que
light. Some of
pesa un
them
grano de café y
are
eso
the
nos da
same
la
weight as a
posibilidad
grain of
de poder
coffee,
marcar
and that
a
allows
un rango
us
muy grande de
to
aves e inclusive insectos.
put
Aquí
them
la
on
segunda
a great
parte
range
tenemos
of birds and
diferentes
even
tipos de
insects.
transmisores.
I'm
El
going
marcador de
to explain that
cellular
we have
technologies
two. We
y
have
esto
low-tech
no es otro tipo
transmitters
de
and
clase de
CTT.
transmisores.
And this is not to promote
Nada más
any
les
of the
digo que
brands.
estos
I'm not
transmisores
selling
emiten
transmitters.
diferente
It's just so
frecuencia
you know
y
that
esto
these have
tiene
different
implicaciones
frequencies,
muy
and that
grandes
has
después.
implications that I'm going to cover later in
Cuando
the
lo comparas con
presentation.
otros transmisores, pues
When you
puedes ver
compare it
que
to other
el peso es
transmitters,
algo
you can
importante,
see
pero
that the
también
weight is
estos
something important,
transmisores
but also
son
the cost.
relativamente baratos,
These
porque cuestan
are
$50
relatively cheap,
y que
about
dan una experiencia tener
$250,
pues
which
camada
allow
de
us
muestras muy
to
amplias
have
y de
a
diferente forma.
wider or a bigger
La
scale
tercera
sample.
diferencia que les voy a comentar
And the third difference is the type of data and resolution. I think Motus has a great temporal resolution. When you detect a bird in a station, it transmits every 5 seconds. And with other technologies, maybe they are using batteries or they are using a lot of energy, and this means that we have weeks or hours or days in between detections. And also, spatial resolution is very good at Motus because we are able to detect data of presence and absence. So we have a Motus station, for example, here, and we have the different points, and you can detect where in this spatial range your bird is. Not exactly, but it gives us a good idea. If we use GPS, of course, the error percentage decreases, but this is just for you to take into consideration. And well, the question that people always ask, how much? How much does a station cost? And as a biologist, it all depends. Depends on the type of station that you require, the objective of the project, how difficult it is to get to the site, and maybe if you're just considering the costs of the materials and not the costs of commuting to the site, of paying your staff. But I'm going to give you a concrete example. And to understand better, I'm going to give you a general explanation of the anatomy. We have a general structure that needs to have antennas. We have small antennas and big antennas, and they have different frequencies. We have a frequency of 434 megahertz that would detect CTT transmitters, and the 166 megahertz antenna that detects low-tech transmitters. Then the signal goes through a coaxial cable, and then it goes to a sensor station. So with all this context, I'm going to give you two extreme examples. It may be a site where you want to monitor uh, a specific population, where we have Wi-Fi connectivity, electricity. So basically, you have the perfect conditions because maybe you just need to install a post with a small unidirectional antenna, and maybe your station can be around $1,500. An extreme case is you need to put your station in a very remote area of the forest to detect migratory birds, and ideally the station needs to be very tall so it overpasses the canopy of the trees, and it should be a robust station so it can survive any natural threat like hurricanes or winds. And because we don't have Wi-Fi connection or electricity, then you would have to install a solar panel and a network, maybe by a mobile provider. That would increase the cost greatly, and that's why I say that the cost varies a lot and it depends on the conditions. I also want to mention what are the optimal conditions, the sweet spot to use Motus. Motus is better when working with smaller animals, especially those that travel long distances. Why? Because there are no other transmitters that can be put on these type of animals. So it allows us to track those small animals. It is also great when we have a species that you cannot recapture more than once. So if you put a geotransmitter in your bird, but you never recapture them, then you're not going to be able to have more data. And third, Motus is very good, especially when you're working in geographical areas where we have a high density of Motus stations. So your data is going to be a lot more refined in this area of the United States than in the Amazon, where we don't have many stations. Although I can say that if you detect your birds here and they travel north, they're definitely going to be detected in the north. So this is just for you to consider in the studies that you're doing. And the last slide of this part, I just want to talk about everything that has been done thanks to Motus. We have over 250 Motus publications where we found things like flight metrics, threats, the population ecology, local movements, regional movements, migration strategy, and habitat use and conservation. So if you have an idea of a project, you can visit this link. You can have an idea of what has already been done. So I hope that this gave you some context, and if you have a question, please feel free to approach us or ask it, and we will reply it at the end of this presentation. And well, in Mexico, we didn't know about the Motus network, and we were able to expand this network in only a couple of years. And how did that happen? Well, if it's helpful for you, I would be very happy to tell you how we did it. It all started when I started my PhD journey. I had the idea of learning on migration ecology of the Pacific red knot, and back then we didn't have a lot of technologies that we could use with these species in a safe way. So that's when I learned about the Motus technology, and with this image, I realized that this is exactly that I was looking for, because if a butterfly can have one of these transmitters, then definitely the red knot could as well. The big problem was that in the west part of the continent, the Pacific Flyway, we had basically zero stations, so that meant no detections. So I got in touch with colleagues who have been super important for this. Many of you know Mary Whitfield. Her, along with other colleagues, started to think about a plan because we could see that there was a Motus network in place on the east side, and it only took a couple of years. So why wouldn't we replicate that in the west? In Mexico, I approached many partners. A lot of them got excited about the plan, and our plan was very easy. Each partner was going to install a Motus station to answer a specific research question with the priority species that they were working with. And this would help start and kick off a conservation and research agenda with these species in mind. And well, I thought that this would be an easy path, straight line, but reality is always different. From the beginning, we had issues with funding, for example. There was a very big learning curve. Bringing the equipment from the US to Mexico was always a problem, and then we were hit by COVID. However, I'm going to explain my journey with this graph. So I call it the Dunning-Kruger effect in Motus, just when you thought you knew everything. Because this learning curve pushed us to learn about radio communications, electricity, building, structures, and well, us as biologists, we were not aware of all this knowledge. So our first stations, we should have thought about this before. I'm going to give you an example. This is in a lighthouse in Guerrero Negro, and this was one of the most successful one. It was super tall. It would have a lot of detections. However, when I visited next year, I discovered that the roof had collapsed. Actually, the lighthouse was about to collapse on itself. So that's something I should have looked into before. I also should have thought about natural disasters like hurricanes. They did have an impact on our stations. Even leaving a station out in nature is going to make it into a home of many animals like beehives, and of course corrosion and rust near the shoreline also had an impact on our station. So we reached our valley of despair, and we were like, oh no, how are we going to fix this? And that's where collaboration also was the thing that kept the project going. We had many partners along the flyway, and we were able to find the best way to install stations to make them stronger, to make them robust so they could stand storms, hurricanes, etc. And we also were able to make it sustainable so they became better and faster. So we started to hit the slope of enlightenment and we were like, oh, this is how we were supposed to do it. So what have we accomplished? Within all these years of work, the most important thing is that now we have a community of scientists and conservationists that know how to set up a station, know how to give maintenance, and now they're detecting birds from their different work sites. And we can see that reflected in these maps. In 2019, in the west, we had only a few Motus stations scattered around. And look at this amazing growth. In just 5 years, in the west, we have over 250 stations. In the northwest, we have installed 32 stations, and in the whole country, double that with the support of more collaborators. In the northwest, we have all of these stations, and they are located in protected areas. And in Ramsar site, which is a critical support for the National Commission of Protected Birds, so we can monitor the birds that are present in this area. We also started to carry out our own tagging efforts. I started with the red knot, but our partners also started tagging other species which are of interest for conservation. And I'm going to give you the example of the red knot. We started not knowing much about the migration ecology, and after a couple of years of work, and once we had a more extensive Motus network, now we have migratory parameters in many of the sites that they use in Mexico and along the flyway. We can determine connectivity that they have towards the north. That's something that we didn't know anything about. We also can start to forecast their migration routes. We are working on analyzing that work now, so we are only at preliminary results. And some interesting things that we have come across is that red knots migrate from the northwest of Mexico to the north, and apparently they divide in two. It's two different groups. We have groups that travel on the shoreline, and we have groups that travel through the desert. Here is a little bit more simplified. The group that goes on the shoreline is through the Central Valley of California. And to me, that makes a lot of sense because during this time of the year, there is a lot of water in the rice fields. However, the other group goes around the mountains and travels through the desert and that is something that we did not expect at all. And they stop in very specific places, and when we zoom in, we realize that it's because there is water. And we also had another surprise. Some red nuts were flying even to the middle of the continent in Wyoming, somewhere where we would never expect to see a red knot. But it is more interesting that after the storms, that red knot flies straight to Vancouver on a straight line, and they know perfectly how to go back to the original flyway that should have followed. And it's not only about information of the species that we have tagged, we have also detected species that have been tagged in Canada and the US. And to us, that is a great achievement because setting up these stations in the northwest of Mexico is not only creating data for us, but it is also helping to strengthen the links between breeding sites and non-breeding sites of many birds. And that is something that we had not been able to achieve with another tracking technology. Only with Motus we have been able to do this. So what is next? We think that we are at this point at the plateau of sustainability because now we have a very mature Motus network that brings quality data, and that's exactly what we are going to do. We're going to continue supporting the growth of the Motus network, and now bringing support in the northwest of Mexico and in other places through training and setting up stations. And now the critical part that we are focusing on is how to analyze the great amount of information that we are gathering. And that's what's taking most of our time now, because up to now we have not been able to do so. And finally, we are integrating new technologies to take advantage of all these Motus stations. For example, a lot of you know that other type of transmitters like biologgers and GPS use different antennas. So what we're doing is installing those type of antennas in the Motus stations, so when those birds travel by those stations, we can also collect that data. We are collaborating with the fishing sector, so we can install monitoring cameras at these stations that can help us monitor the use of sites by fishing groups, and we are setting up stations that would collect eco variables about the weather that can complete our analysis. And with this, I want to thank everyone who's listening today. I want to welcome everyone that wants to join this initiative. Please feel free to contact me for advice, training, anything that you need. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Julián, por la
Amazing
Thanks.
talk.
por la presentación. Excelente.
Thank you.
Creo que
Thank you so much for the
tengamos
presentation. I think that we have a couple of minutes for the questions now. You can either open your mic, you can enter the questions in the chat or in the Q&A box. Yes, I'm going to share my contact information in the chat. So if you have any question, please let us know and we will be happy to support.
Yo tengo una pregunta, Julián. Muchas
I
gracias
have a
por
question,
esta
Julián.
presentación muy
Thank you so much
interesante.
for this presentation. It was super interesting.
Excelente trabajo. Y mi
Excellent
pregunta es,
work. And my
¿cuánto
question
tiempo
is,
más o menos
how
llevó
long
hacer toda
did it
esta
take
progresión que mostraste
to
desde el
see
principio de
to do
no
all this
saber nada
progression? So
hasta
from knowing
el valle
nothing
de
until
desesperación
and
como
through
el final
the
de mes
valley of
de
despair until the
sostenibilidad?
plateau of
Es
sustainability.
impresionante y
It's impressive,
sería
truly.
increíble replicarlo en
And
otras
it would be
regiones.
amazing to replicate that work in other regions. I think that this started in 2020 and has been happening up to now. And I know exactly because it started with my PhD. I started thinking that I would be using Motus for my PhD, but the truth is that it took my entire PhD journey to be able to set up the network and start answering questions.
Gracias, muy impresionante.
Thank you. It's impressive. Thank you. Sarah?
Hey, Julian, I'm not going to embarrass myself and try to speak Spanish right now. But thank you for your presentation. It was wonderful. Can you go over really quickly what your biggest challenge has been, especially where you are trying to get Motus stations up or do Motus work or tagging maybe? What's your biggest obstacle and what's the biggest win or the best part of it that you think besides the partnerships? I know that's the best part across the board, but thanks.
Sí, yo pensaría que los partnerships son.
Yes, I would say partnerships definitely are the best achievement. But I think one of the biggest challenges we had was to find the perfect procedure or recipe to set up the stations. So what we were told from the US to do sometimes didn't work in Mexico, and I think that what we have found the best way to do it in Mexico could be replicated and helpful in other parts of Latin America. Let me start again. The biggest challenge was to try to do it as cheap and fast as possible because of the funding available that we had, but we realized that if we set up the stations as robust as possible from the beginning, that would save us a lot of money in the long run. Because if we install a Motus station quick and easy, means that in a couple months we were going to find something failing and we would have to go back to the site. And because they were remote, that would cost money and efforts. So we try to do things as best as possible from the beginning.
Hola, ¿qué tal?
Bianca?
Yo tenía una duda. Yo me
Hello,
acuerdo que
I have a
una vez
question. I
escuché una
remember
charla tuya también y ahorita de
that
que tuvieron como problemas como en enviar
I
ciertos
heard a
como
presentation
componentes de
where there
Estados
was
Unidos para
a problem
Latinoamérica.
sending some
Si
components
eso ha
from the US
cambiado
to
y qué
Latin
tan fácil
America
está
to
ahora
set up
como
the
ese envío,
stations. I
porque
wonder if
digamos,
that
yo
has
fui a hacer
changed,
una
if it has been
propuesta y
easier,
llegaba
because
alguien
I'm
de una
working
rama
on
que le
making
daba
a
aprobación,
proposal
pero
and
es
we are
con
in
el
the
gobierno
second
de
stage of
Guatemala.
approval,
Entonces
but it's with the
puedo hacer
government
un
of Guatemala.
proceso de
So
que
everything
comprar todo, ya
is
comprar,
going through them. So
conseguir
they
el
have to
proveedor que me
purchase
las
everything.
envíe,
I need to
facturas y
find a
todo.
provider that
Entonces no
sends them
sé
to
si
me. I need to
está
get
aún siendo
invoices for
difícil
everything.
esa
So
parte o ya es
I
como
want to
más
know how difficult
accesible toda
that
esta
part
compra de
is, or is it
materiales y
becoming
todo lo que
more
requiere toda una
accessible?
estación.
Is it easier to buy the
Gracias.
materials for the stations?
Para
All of that.
Latinoamérica
Thank you.
es particularmente
Yes, for Latin
complicado
America, it's
obtener
particularly
los
complicated
materiales
to
necesarios,
get the
particularmente los que
necessary
están
materials,
solamente
especially
disponibles en Estados Unidos.
those
Por
that are
ejemplo,
only available in the
en Estados
US.
Unidos,
For
pues tú te vas a
example,
Amazon
in the
y
US, you
luego
go
lo
to
compras
Amazon,
y en 2
you write
días está
whatever
en
you
tu
want,
casa.
and 2 days later, you
Pero
have it at
en
your
este
door.
caso,
And
yo tuve la
here, that
fortuna de
doesn't
estar
happen. I am
viviendo en la
lucky
frontera con
to
Estados
be
Unidos.
living at the
Puedo
border
cruzar a
with
Estados
the
Unidos
US, and I
y
can
traer las
cross over to
cosas.
the US and bring the
Pero en
stuff
otras
back
partes de
myself.
Latinoamérica
But
no.
in other parts of
Entonces la
Latin America,
respuesta
that's
es,
not going
en la
to
mayoría
happen.
de casos,
So
tenemos que
the answer
adaptar
is that
los componentes
you need to
locales
adapt
al,
to the local components that you have
región.
available in your
Y
region.
eso significa
And that
que
means
si en tu país
that if
las
in your
antenas
country
a lo mejor son ilegales por
antennas
ley,
maybe are
no
illegal
puedes
because
comprar un nuevo
there
componente,
are places where
pues
we
puedes
cannot
hacerlo
install
tú mismo.
antennas,
Y es lo que hemos
then you
descubierto.
can make the
No
antennas
hacemos
at
comercialización ni
your
nada. Es
place.
una
We
antena
don't
relativamente
market them, but
sencilla.
making an antenna is relatively easy.
Hay algunas cosas que definitivamente
There are some
se
things
dependerían
that you're
de
definitely going to depend
Estados Unidos,
on
como si
the
quieres un
US.
sensor
For
de
example, if you
desarrollo
want a
en tu
sensor
país.
station, then somebody's going to have to bring that to you.
Pero hemos descubierto que
But
casi
we've
todos los
discovered
materiales
that
podemos
most
adaptarlos
of the
porque
materials can be adapted
y es algo
to
de lo que
Latin
estamos
America.
también tratando de
And that is
trabajar mucho,
something that we
el
are
cómo hacer un
working
mundo
on,
sustentable en
trying
América
to make it
Latina y
sustainable
nuestros planes de hacer
in
antenas,
Latin
por ejemplo,
America.
queremos
And
compartirlo
our
con
plan of
ustedes,
making
pero
antennas,
todavía no estamos
we
ahí, todavía no
would be
estamos como
happy
el
to share it
prototipo.
with you, but we are still working on a prototype, so we're not quite there yet.
Gracias de nuevo, Julián.
Thank you so much,
Creo
Julian.
que vamos
I
a
think
tener tiempo para más
we
preguntas al fin,
will have more
pero
time
ahora
at the
voy a
end
dar
of the
paso a
presentations,
Ana
but
para
now
introducir las
I'm
siguientes slides.
going to leave the
Gracias,
floor to
Amy, y
Ana
gracias
to
de nuevo a
introduce
Julián
Paz
por
and
esta
Ernesto.
excelente
Thank you, Amy,
presentación.
and thank you, Julian, for this great
Ahora es
presentation.
un gran placer
Now it
dar
is a
la
great
bienvenida a
pleasure
Paz
to
Irola y
welcome
Ernesto
Paz,
Carmán.
Arola,
Ernesto y
and
Paz son
Ernesto
dos
Carmen.
naturalistas
They
puertorriquenses,
are
Ernesto
two
profesionales
naturalists from Costa
investigadores de
Rica.
campo que
They
trabajan
are
con
field
especies de
ambassadors for
aves
bird
residentes y
watching, and they
migratorias
work with
que son
resident and
prioridades de
migratory
conservación.
species. They
Entre
are a
ellos se
conservation
encuentran
priority
la lechita
and
parda, el pinzón cafetalero y la arenita cerúlea. Colaboran con el crecimiento de
with
Motus desde 2019, instalando
conservation
la primera
species.
estación en Costa Rica
They
y
installed the
supervisa la
first station in
coordinación de
Costa
Motus
Rica
en
and they
Centroamérica.
supervised the
Y
Motus
desde una
coordination
perspectiva
in
más
Central
personal,
America.
ellos
And from a
son
more
un
personal
equipo increíble que
perspective, they are
trabaja
a great team
incansablemente para
that
reproducir
work
la red Motus en
tirelessly
Centroamérica
to
y,
get the
más
Motus
importante,
network
para
to Latin
desarrollar
America, and
capacidades
more
locales
importantly, to
para
develop
marcar aves de forma
local
segura y de
capabilities to
instalar
mark birds,
estaciones
to
Motus.
tag birds in a
Tuve
safe way,
suerte de
to
haber tenido el
install
privilegio
Motus
de trabajar con
stations,
ellos y
and
aprender de
I've
ellos en
had the
Guatemala
privilege
y
of
estamos
working with
muy
them,
agradecidos
learning
de
from them
su
in Guatemala, and we are
colaboración
very,
y
very
apoyo.
thankful for their collaboration
Entonces,
and
muchas
support.
gracias, Paz y
So
Ernesto, por
thank
estar
you,
aquí con
Paz and
nosotros.
Ernesto, for being
Y
here
les paso la
today,
palabra.
and the floor is yours. Thank you so much, Anna, for the invitation, and welcome everyone listening. For us, it's a great pleasure to share the experience that we've had. And it is not necessarily work. It's not just work, it's something that we're passionate about. And well, if we didn't like it so much, we wouldn't be putting so much effort day and night, right? So Julian did an amazing work explaining how Motus work and explaining the Motus network. So that is going to make easier for us explain our experience. We want to talk about how we got started with Motus and then how that has helped growing the network in Central America, and it has been impressive, truly. And what took us to Motus was this species specifically, the cerulean warbler, and since 2006 we have been following them. We found a site in Costa Rica around the volcano in a place called Las Brisas Reserve, and back then it was abnormal to find these amounts of cerulean warblers in this region. We didn't know much about where they would stop during their migration. And for the cerulean warbler, this is not a breeding site, and this is not a wintering site either, because they would spend the winter in Venezuela, Colombia, and Peru, and they breed in the north. So they are just stopping by here, and this is a very rare species for us to find here, and if we were able to see it, we would consider us lucky. But in this specific site, in Las Brisas Reserve, we had unusual numbers. It was very high numbers, and that caught our attention. And so we thought that we should follow up on what was happening. So we continued to do that. We started doing surveys. We created Nature and Birds Festival with the cerulean warbler as the center species. So we had people visiting from all over Costa Rica to see the cerulean warbler. And that's where we met Ana. She arrived once when we were doing surveys. And all of this thanks to the cerulean warbler that also caught the attention of international scientists and researchers, and that opened the door for us to collaborate and establish a relationship with foreign organizations, because we were working locally and we were doing our surveys and that was it. But fortunately, we got in touch with different organizations, especially with Selva, because Selva were the ones who opened a lot of doors regarding training and everything else. And we were also able to become part of a project that is led by Selva. This is one of their biggest projects, which is the Neotropical Flyways project, which is about identifying the stopover sites for migratory birds throughout the flyway. Those sites that are like gas stations that they do need to stop and recharge to continue with their journey. They recover fat, so they are able to continue. And that's what we thought we had found for the cerulean warbler in Costa Rica. So everything that we had so far was very circumstantial. We only had observations of the cerulean warbler, and when we started working with Selva, besides doing surveys of migratory birds in general, which was important to identify stopover sites, we started to do banding. So thanks to banding, and with color-coded banding in the cerulean warbler, we were able to have an idea of how many days they would spend in this reserve, because before that we knew that we had many. We would observe many of them, but we were not sure of how many days they were there. We didn't know if it was a couple of hours, a couple of days, a couple of weeks. So we started color coding the bands. And if you have experience observing, or if you have tried to observe a cerulean warbler, It's very difficult. They fly up very high. They're very up there in the trees. So observing them and trying to observe the band in their leg and identifying what color it is, it's harder. However, we were able to collect very interesting data on how long they would stay, and we discovered it was an average of 4 days. And thanks to Selva, we got introduced to Motus. This was our first experience getting to know about Motus, and when they told us how it worked, and this was back in 2019. It blew my mind. When I found out what you could do after years of following the cerulean warbler, I was like, oh my God, this is great. If we could have a single station in Costa Rica would be amazing. And thanks to Selva, we were able to get some antennas. We set up the first Motus station in Costa Rica back in 2019 with the intention of answering the question that we had about the cerulean warbler. How many days do they actually stay in the reserve? And instead of depending on bird watching and on banding, the moment that we set a radio transmitter to an individual and release it in the reserve, the station is kind of listening to the individual, and the moment it leaves, we know. So if you remember, I said the average of days that they stay, we thought it was 3 to 4 days. But with 12 individuals that we were able to put radio transmitters, we discovered that it's actually between 8 and 16 days. And this reinforces the idea that this area of Costa Rica that is very, very small is extremely important for the migration, the fall migration of the cerulean warbler, because they're not only stopping over there, but they are staying a couple of days and they're using the site to gain weight to continue with their journey. And back then, we didn't have a lot of stations in South America or Panama. We were not expecting a lot of detections outside of the country, but we did have one in the Panama Canal. And another one is the individual in the photo where you can see the radio transmitter, which is the white part on the back, and the antenna that is coming out from the tail. And that was detected in Colombia. So it was a success. That first station and that first round of radio transmitters, and it was able to answer that very important question that we had. We also were able to do more things, of course, and it's not only depending of automated detection of the stations, but you can also combine it with manual methods, because here we have the Motus radio transmitter, but we also were able to detect it manually, and that gave us a better idea about the home range of these individuals where they spend time at the reserve. And with that first experience with the cerulean warbler as a pilot to work with different species, we did another pilot to see if we were able to do it, and in 2023 now we are able to work at a bigger scale with many collaborators and partners with 50 individuals in Costa Rica. So after that pilot, this is the golden-winged warbler. We were able to detect where they traveled in the spring, and this is part of the team that collaborated back in 2023. Maybe some people that are hearing this presentation today are present in that picture. And more recently, we did a test with the wood thrush in 2022, which allowed us to work in a bigger project, which is currently taking place. And it is over 600 transmitters that were put in the breeding sites and in non-breeding sites in Central America and Mexico to understand migration connectivity better and mortality rates, etc. This project is currently happening. And a little bit of outcomes that we had instead, besides having impressive data like the ones that Julian showed, we also have very impressive data, and increasing it to a bigger scale, we are talking about 600 marked individuals, is going to give us an amazing idea on conservation efforts. We are going to know more clearly what to prioritize. I'm going to continue. I'm Ana. Thank you so much for the invitation. Well, from the species that Ernesto has mentioned, what they have in common is that they are migratory species in a vulnerable state, talking about conservation. Since we got to know Motus in 2019 after setting up the first station, we have always been in favor of this technology because it's useful not only for studying migratory birds, but also resident birds. As we know, resident birds don't get as much attention, especially in Latin America, where our governments do not have conservation as one of their priorities, or investing in the environment in general. So we found that Motus could also be helpful to ecological needs of resident species. And one example is this species, hook-billed kite. And we've been working with this species since 2023, doing observations, surveys here in the Cartago province, in the Central Valley of Costa Rica. And this species has been present. Well, like we explained about the cerulean warbler, we found an abnormal amount of the hook-billed kite. So they were in chayote plantations, and when they are usually in the forest. So, because we realized that there was a high number, once we had this experience with Motus, we started to band and putting transmitters to the kite. They are about 300 grams. They are a medium-sized raptor bird, and he replaced it near the wing. This transmitter was originally for the golden wing warbler. And we got a donation of 12 transmitters that we were meant to use for the gold-winged warbler, to use them because a project was not going to be able to use them anymore. So what we did was taking advantage of those transmitters, and we adapted them and we put them on the hook-billed kite. So what originally was for a warbler was useful for a bird that is 300 grams. So part of this, and connected to what Julian said, I think in Latin America, we're experts in taking advantage of all resources and opportunities that we have available and actually use them and adapt them to our needs. Sometimes you have to get creative, so we adapted those transmitters so they wouldn't tear them off because they have a big bill, and they could do that. So, well, in summary, we have placed transmitters that are compatible with the Motus system. And what is special about this species? Well, it is well known that we have resident population. Their distribution angle is very wide from Texas to Argentina. So we are able to identify the individuals in this range. And there are also part of the population, which is a migratory one. We don't know a lot about the migration ecology of the hook-billed kite. So our goal is to place transmitters on individuals of this species, and we have been able to put bigger transmitters that last longer. And although these transmitters were originally for warblers, we were able to get very important outcomes. One of them was the detection of an individual that spent the winter since it was captured. It spent 3 months in Costa Rica feeding on chayotes. And originally, they usually feed on snails. And then it was detected again in Guatemala. So this is a regional movement, and this is the first data about the hook-billed kite that starts moving from a wintering site to a breeding site. We don't know if it stayed in Guatemala. It might have stayed on the Pacific side of Guatemala. There is kind of a pretty story there. That station was placed by us in 2022, I think. There we are, with the owner of that station. And months later, one of our individuals from Costa Rica was detected in that station that we helped place in Guatemala. We don't know if it stayed there or if it flew to Mexico. Back then, we didn't have many stations placed, but it was very important, a very important discovery for the migration ecology. We are also able to detect the use of habitat of resident species. Basically, the idea is that these points, each of them was obtained using manual coordinates. And we are focusing on these chayote plantations. So Motus is helping us answer questions that are important about the use of habitat, especially for these plantation related to these species. And as Julian mentioned at the beginning in 2019, when we started to work with Motus, we didn't have that many stations in Costa Rica. Well, in Costa Rica, we had the first one, and we had some in Panama and one in Nicaragua. We didn't have any other station in the rest of the countries in Central America. And nowadays, this is a current picture of the map of the Motus network in Central America. As you can see, it has grown a lot and the expansion continues to happen. We have a lot of stations in Costa Rica. How many do we have? 22. And we have recently installed stations in Honduras, in Belize, and being a small country, it has many stations. We have some in Guatemala. So the idea is that the Motus network continues to expand here in Central America. And besides the interesting side for science, what we can achieve with Motus, because we think Motus goes beyond science, is more than collecting data. It's also working with people. It's also establishing alliances with people, with communities, with institutions, like Julian mentioned, and we are really truly fans of Motus networks. Why do we like working with this technology so much? It's because this is a technology that is relatively easy to use, both installing Motus stations and placing the radio transmitters. Our learning curve was huge. Like Julian, we came from banding birds to learning to set up stations and placing the radio transmitters in different species, to know a little bit of engineering, electronics, building. But in general, it's a technology that it's easy to use, it's easy to install once you have the necessary resources. And like Julian mentioned, we believe that Motus has revolutionized the way we study migration ecology in species. Yes, we have technologies that are more precise because they use GPS, for example, with solar panels, etc. But the weight of those transmitters cannot be held by a warbler. And in comparison with the Motus transmitters, that gives us a lot more range of species that we can work with and that are smaller and light. So, as Ernesto was explaining, the type of data that we are able to obtain compared to other tracking methods that are used in ecology, like banding and observing or recapturing banded individuals, increases with the use of these technologies. So in a very short amount of time, we were able to do a great effort in observing cerulean warblers in less than a year, having a more refined and precise data of the movement of the cerulean warbler in this site. So that means that this technology optimizes the time and resources and data for researchers. And something very particular that Motus have is its nature for collaboration. For example, in Canada, they are setting up more stations, or in Mexico, they are setting up more Motus stations. It's also beneficial for us here in Costa Rica because our research questions regarding the hook-billed kite is interesting for us, that in Mexico there is a network. There is a Motus network because we know that they fly up north. They go to Guatemala or the north of Central America or even Mexico. So we all get benefits from the efforts that all researchers and scientists do, because everyone that uses Motus is interested in the movements of the species in a region and the species that visit. And we would like to wrap up our presentation saying that this has been something that was inherited by Selva. Selva is a Colombian organization that is dedicated to the study of migration of migratory birds. And so we have been working in collaboration with them since 2016. And they have communicated to us the importance of the participation of the local community. Everywhere we go, banding or observing, we need to plant that seed and create that interest in the local and the people living locally, to understand the importance of setting up these stations, of installing this or placing these transmitters so they can work on their own projects in the future and they have a sense of ownership. It's not about someone coming and installing a station. It's about them taking ownership of it and become responsible to understand how it works so they can start working on their own projects. A great example, a couple of weeks ago, we were in Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras, setting up Motus stations for a bigger project. In each of the countries, we trained at least one person for setting up Motus stations and for placing radio transmitters. And in previous years, we've had the opportunity to give workshops and training courses on Motus in general. Here we can see the pictures of setting up the stations, of placing radio transmitters. And here we had the participation of scientists and people that have Motus projects in other Central American countries. And that is all.
Wow, muchísimas gracias, Paz y Ernesto, por esta presentación iluminante.
Thank you so much,
Bravo,
Paz and
increíble y
Ernesto.
inspirador.
Great work. It's
Gracias.
very
Me
inspiring.
encanta,
Thank you
lo
so
de
much.
enfocarse
I
no
love
solo en las aves
that you
migratorias, pero también
focus
en las aves
on resident
residentes
birds as
que
well,
como
and
vieron
not only
reciben
migratory
menos
birds,
atención
because
y
as you
fondos, pero
mentioned,
también
they receive
merecen
less
ser
attention
estudiados
and less funding, but
esta
they do
perspectiva.
deserve to be studied. So I think it's great that you're doing that.
Entonces, Vamos a avanzar
So
ahora a
we're
la
going
parte
to
de
move on to
discusión,
the discussion
y
part
question and answer. Entonces,
and Q&A.
pueden
So
poner
you
preguntas para
can
Julián, y
ask
para Paz
questions
Ernesto en el
to
chat.
Julian or to
O
Paz and
por favor,
Ernesto. You
si
can use
quieren
the
levantar
chat.
la
Feel
mano,
free to
y
raise your
pueden
hand and
preguntar
open your
sus
microphone as
propias
well.
preguntas. A ver, creo que habían
I
algunas
think
preguntas
we have some questions already
para Julián.
for Julian.
Ok, Julián ya respondió la pregunta
Well,
de
Julian
Isabel.
already replied to
Um,
Isabel's question.
Y por favor, Amy o Fabiola o Maya,
And
si
Amy,
tienen
Fabiola,
otras preguntas
if you see
que
other
no salgan en el chat,
questions
por favor,
that maybe I'm not
ayúdanos.
seeing, feel free to mention them.
Ok, pues voy a aprovechar
Well,
mientras
then,
esperan otras preguntas.
while we wait for
Tengo
other
una
questions,
pregunta
I
para
do,
Pastor Ernesto.
I have a question myself for Paz and
Desde
Ernesto.
su punto de vista,
From your
¿cuáles son
point
como
of
las
view,
áreas prioritarias
what are
para
the
detectar nuevos motus
priority
y eso
areas
es para Julián
for
también?
new Motus stations?
Pero
Well, actually, this
para
could be
nuevas
for Julian as
estaciones
well.
motus
But for
en
where would you like to
Centroamérica,
place new
porque
Motus
todavía hay
stations
como
in Central America?
lagunas
Because I know that
de
as of
estaciones.
now,
Y
there are not enough
también, ¿qué
stations.
posibilidades
And
verían para
what are
más proyectos
possibilities
regionales y internacionales, como
are
puede ser el
you
Woodrush,
seeing for
Ustedes piensan
international and national
en el
projects, for
nuevo
example,
Conservation Investment
the
Strategy
wood trash
para el
project?
Caribe? Y
For
como
example, maybe in
sabemos,
the
no hay muchas
Caribbean,
estaciones
we
en esta zona,
know we
especialmente
don't have a lot of
Honduras y
stations
Nicaragua,
in
y
that area,
tampoco
or
hay en otros
especially in
países.
Honduras and
Entonces, sí me
Nicaragua.
gustaría
So
saber
I would like to know
qué piensan sobre esto como
what you
áreas
think
prioritarias para nuevas
about
estaciones.
priority areas to start setting up more Motus stations. Well, I think one of the great advantages that we have from Mexico to Panama is this boom effect, because all the birds that come from Canada and the US concentrate in higher numbers here. So with a smaller number of stations, we are able to detect more individuals with less effort. So basically, any station that you set up in Central America or in the Tehuantepec is going to have a great number of detections. But one of the things that we always try to communicate whenever we travel, they always ask us, where can we set up a station? Because it's something that they're interested in. And one of the main things is, well, these are the requirements. It needs to be a safe place. You need to have access to electricity, etc. But it is important to make a list of the sites that they think fulfill those requirements. So as soon as there is funding, they already have a place in mind, a preliminary place, because specific places, there are many. And I think that a lot of these can be backed up with the surveys that we have done with the Neotropical Flyways project. So many of those places have been identified, so we already have a baseline on where to start. But of course, many of those sites that are mentioned, for example, in the Caribbean, Nicaragua, Honduras, those are places difficult to access. They're not the safest. So we do have those limitations there. But I think that the concrete data exists and Selva has them. And so we have an argument to say why those places would be good to have a Motus station. But basically, I think, like I mentioned before, any place in Central America is the best place to have a station. Well, as long as you're not putting it in a hole, where you don't have any sites, any detections. It needs to fulfill the basic requirements, but because of the funnel effect that we have, we are able to have a lot of detections with not that many stations present. And we didn't mention this, but something that we came across is that besides having that excitement of getting to know Motus and start campaigning for Motus to start spreading the word. Something that we found is that, yes, it grew organically and exponentially. In Costa Rica, we were able to have many stations. Not all of them are ours. We are not in charge of the maintenance of all of them, but being able to have or to forecast maintenance in a medium and long term is very important, because we have seen that, yes, it sounds like a great idea to go and set up a station somewhere. Here is the money, get the equipment, install it. Great, that's awesome. But then, if you don't have maintenance in mind, if you don't have the capability of giving it maintenance for a medium or long term, then you end up losing the money. So it is about thinking ahead, not only about purchasing the equipment, but also consider funding for maintenance as well, because sometimes it's just a waste. There are stations that just don't work because there is no capability to bring maintenance. But it's not a bad thing. Of course, it's not a bad thing to have as many stations as possible, but it is important to keep in mind that every station that you install will need a maintenance effort in the long term. So I think that is important to consider when
Excelente.
talking about
Muchas
funding.
gracias. Buenos consejos.
Thank you. Thank you so
Ah,
much.
Yo
That is
quisiera
great
nada más
advice.
agregar
I just want to add something
una respuesta
to that.
más allá de decir dónde poner
So
estaciones.
beyond
Yo pensaría que es súper
talking about
estratégico
where to set up
hablar con
stations, I
otras
think that it
personas
is
que tienen ideas del
strategic to talk
mercado.
to
Es decir, nuestros
other
mayores éxitos
parties
de
that
base
are
de
aware
detecciones han
of
venido
tagging.
cuando
Our
nos
greatest
organizamos con
successes have come
investigadores y
when we
conservacionistas de
organize
Estados Unidos y
ourselves
Canadá para
with
marcar a las mismas
people working in
especies, porque
conservation in
sabemos
Canada and the
entonces dónde
US
tenemos que
to
poner esas
tag the same
estaciones para
species,
tener el
because
mayor número
then
de
we know
detecciones.
where to set up
Ellos los
those
marcan y nosotros los
stations.
detectamos,
So
o al
they tag
revés.
them and we
Entonces,
detect
eso para
them, or the
nosotros
other way
funciona mucho.
around.
Y
So
eso
that
solo
worked
viene
very well for us,
solo
and
de
that
estar
only
platicando con la
happens
gente,
when
¿no?
you start talking
Ujú.
to other people.
Sí, buen punto, Julián.
Yes, that's a great
Gracias.
point, Julian. Thank you.
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Any other question?
Tengo una pregunta
I
para
do have a
Julián.
question for Julian.
¿Sabías antes de tu
Did you
trabajo
know
que
before your work
suizos migran
that the red
por el
nuts
desierto
travel
y no
through the
solo
desert
para la ruta
and not
costera?
only on the shoreline?
No, no
Did you know
teníamos
that
ni
or no?
idea. Yo no me
No, we had
imaginaba.
no idea.
Realmente
I never
esta
thought
fue la primera
that
vez
would
que lo habíamos
happen.
documentado
Actually, that
y
was the
pues es
first
súper
time that it was
interesante.
documented, and it
Sí,
is
muy
incredibly
interesante.
interesting.
Ujú.
Yes, I
Entonces,
agree.
ahora esta fue la última temporada que
So
marcamos
this was the
12
last
adicionales y
season
ahora vamos a empezar a
where
analizar
we
los datos.
tagged 12 red knots, and now we're
Pues
going to
estamos
focus on
emocionados de ver qué
analyzing the
encontramos.
data.
También otras
And we are very
investigadoras en
excited to
Alaska
see what we
marcaron tallos
found.
rojizos
Also in
pero tienen
Alaska,
movimientos al
they
sur
tagged
también.
red knots,
Entonces, eso es
and
súper
now we have the
interesante
movement to
para
the
nosotros
south.
porque queríamos
So that
tratar de
is
saber un
incredibly
poquito más
interesting for us. But
anual de qué
now
estamos
we're
viendo.
going to have an idea of the whole year cycle. Excellent. Thank you.
I have a question for Paz and Ernesto. So I have the same question as I did for Julian, but from your perspective in Costa Rica in particular, or in your experience with Motus, what is the biggest challenge to you where you are? Maybe it's capacity, maybe it's having to travel around and put up a lot of Motus stations in other countries even because we need more people who know how to do those things, which is great that Selva is helping to train those folks. But from your perspective, what's the biggest barrier or challenge when you're doing Motus? And what's something exciting that's on the horizon for Motus for you?
Yes. Entonces, casi respondo en inglés, pero
I almost replied in English.
creo que
I think,
similar a lo que dijo Julián.
similar to what Julian said,
Por lo menos lo de conseguir el equipo,
well, getting the
importar el
equipment,
equipo, pues
importing the equipment is
difícil a veces.
hard. It's hard to do. There is always something, but we always find a solution. Somebody can bring it to us, or we create it, or we do it locally. But I think the maintenance of the local network is the biggest challenge because the more stations we have,
Sin que sea como la única cosa que se está haciendo, es muy difícil, ¿verdad?
it's not the only thing that you're doing. You're not only installing Motus stations, it's not about traveling and installing a new one, but also giving maintenance to each of them. And that goes along with developing that local capacity. And so not only have a few people that know about Motus, we need to have actual technicians because yes, it is not so complicated to give maintenance to a station to guarantee that it continues to work. But we need to think of a way of having a solution to the problems in a more effective way. So talking about local capacity would be key, not only in placing transmitters, but in maintenance, basic maintenance for Motus stations. I think that is something critical that we need to think about to have the network fully working and exciting. Well, I don't know where to start. There are so many things. Maybe from the point of view that Paz was mentioning, applying Motus technology on resident species, which maybe don't move throughout the flyway all the way to the north, but they move at a regional level. That makes me very excited because we have ideas of working with umbrella species to understand more species, and focusing on resident species can help. I mean, we understand completely why the main funding focus is on migratory birds, but we would love to know more about the resident birds, and we could do that together, especially when working with this type of network. I think this is going to be very important, and it is very exciting, at least from my point of view. I would also add that in that sense of using the technology in resident birds makes us as Latin American people motivated to look for opportunities, because not opportunities are not going to arrive to us from the US and Canada and say, hey, look, here is the money so you can work with these species. When we focus on resident birds, then that puts the pressure on us to look for the funding for studying the resident species here, because we saw the world report of the status of the birds around the world, and the statistics for resident species are, well, they're not great, and a lot of things are unknown, specifically because the lack of information that we have, that we could bridge that gap with Motus technology. And talking about the project for mean altitudes, I think if we work together,
el trabajar solamente con aves migratorias
because
cuando damos
we
la
have
plática
found
con los
that when we're
locales,
only working
siempre
with
sale la
migratory
pregunta, ¿por
species
qué
and we're
están
giving
trabajando solamente con aves
presentations
migratorias? ¿Por qué
to
no
local
están trabajando
people,
con
they
aves
ask
locales?
us,
Creo
why are
que
you working with
sería un poquito
migratory
más de ese
species and you're
sentido
not
de lo
working with
preguntas.
resident
No
species?
sé si
So
estoy
I think
teniendo
working on
el camino
resident
correcto,
species
pero
would give a sense of
este,
ownership, and I don't know if that would be the right
creo que
term to
utilizando
use,
también motos
but I
con aves
think
residentes y en
Motus,
conjunto con aves migratorias, porque
using
se
Motus for
puede
both
reforzar
migratory and
muchísimo
resident
estos logros de
species, we
conservación,
can
¿verdad? Y trae
reinforce
una
those
más
conservation
evidencia crítica de
efforts because it's only going to give us more evidence that we need to protect the birds. And well, just to wrap up the comment, it is also very exciting that when we work with the local people, we see in the young people the promise. We see that they are interested in birds and they see the outcomes of the work we do with Motus, and while they're working with birds, and when they see everything that can be achieved with this technology, it comes from them. They start getting their own ideas. They start thinking like, oh, it would be great to use this technology with that we're using with the wood thrush, with birds that have regional movements around Costa Rica. So we received that as a feedback from a young person that we have been training a little bit. He has been assisting some of the projects, and he's starting to think about his own projects. So that is very inspiring, and that's when we can see that we have planted a seed and that something is going to come from it. So we hope that those ideas come to life because it is possible.
Thank you for all your work.
¿Podría preguntar algo?
Yeah, go for it, Ryan.
Can I ask
Gracias
something?
por esas presentaciones, me encantaron
Thank you for your
ambos.
presentations.
Quisiera
I love them
preguntar
both.
algo siguiendo esta conversación
I
de aves
would like
residentes
to follow
o de
on
aves
this
que nosotros
conversation
pensamos que
of
son
resident
residentes
species,
y pues
or these birds that we thought were
me
resident
emociona
species and
mucho
we found that
este
they
tema
travel
porque sé
elsewhere.
que
I'm very excited about
algunas
these
aves o
because
puede
I
ser
know
muchísimas aves que
some
nosotros
birds, or
pensamos que
rather
son
many
residentes o
birds, we
pues
thought
que
of them
vuelan un
as
poquito,
resident birds,
que
or maybe
segurísimo que
that they just move
vuelan
around
muchísimo
a
como
little
nosotros
bit,
pensamos. Así
but
como
we are finding that
tucanes
they
o
move a
serpanes
lot
claritensis,
further away
tropis
than we
y
thought,
todo.
like
Solamente
toucans, for
quisiera
example.
preguntar
And
si
I
ellos
want to
tienen
ask
planes
if
para
you have
identificar alguna
plans on
especie que pues
focusing
tienen
on a
mente que
specific
podría
species
mudar mucho
that you
más que
have
lo
in
que
mind
pensábamos
that
o si
maybe is
ustedes tienen
traveling
algunos planes
a
al
lot
respecto.
more than we had initially thought.
Pues creo que con el
I
Hookbill
think
kite fue como
that
un ejemplo
the
perfecto de lo que estás
hook-billed
diciendo, ¿verdad?
kite
Porque
is a
se
great
suponía que
example
eran migratorios
of what you're
simplemente porque
saying
se veían
because
moviéndose en
we
rutas
just
migratorias, pero no
saw
teníamos
that it
idea
would
para
move
dónde
around the
iban.
migratory flyway,
Entonces
but
que
we didn't
tuviéramos
know where they
uno
were
pues
going.
migratorio fue como la primera
So
evidencia como fuerte
to
de
have a
eso.
first
Y la
evidence
primera
of
que se
them
pensaba que
traveling
era
up
simplemente residente.
north, it was
Tenemos
great
varias
because we used to
ideas,
think that it was only a
pero por
resident
ejemplo,
species.
uno que
We
está
have
pidiendo a
different
gritos que
ideas.
pongan transmisores
One of
más con
them
una
that
red
is
muy buena como en Costa
requesting,
Rica es el pájaro campana, el three wattle
well,
shocker, por ejemplo. Porque eso sí, para que algo así funcione, sí tiene que
the
haber una
campana,
red
pájaro
robusta,
campana.
ya creada para que haya
We
reproducciones. Entonces,
should
sí,
start
como Costa
tagging
Rica
that
quedó
one
genial
because
para
we
eso.
have
Ya
the
tenemos una red
bare-throated
muy fuerte,
bellbird.
con muy buena cobertura
We
y
should start tagging that because we have a more
estos
settled
transmisores solo sería cuestión
network
de
species,
aplicarlos, ¿verdad?
and
Y
I
otra
mean network
que
to
nos llama
track these
demasiado
species,
la atención son los
and we would start
insectos o
to
los
study that.
swifts, ¿verdad? No solo
So the
que son
swifts,
migratorios, se sabe que es migratorio, pero estos
we
bencénicos,
know that there
pues
are
no
migratory
tenemos ni
swifts,
idea qué hacen.
but there
Sí,
are
porque se
swift species
mueven
that we have
a
no
través de
idea where they
Centroamérica
are
mucho más de
going.
lo
I'm
que
sure they're
creemos, por ejemplo.
traveling
Y son,
beyond
pues,
Central
sobre
America, not
todo,
only
son
across
insectívoros,
Central
aéreos, y
America.
como
We
todo es tan
know
sofisticado,
that
pues la pérdida de
they
insectos
feed on
también
insects,
esa
and
es
there
otra
is also a
que
concern
está como
about
en
the
nuestro
loss of
radar,
insects. So
ojalá a
that is
mediano
another
plazo de poder trabajar.
species that we're thinking of working with
Gracias.
in the
Lograrlo
short term.
ahora ver estos resultados.
Thank you. I would love to see those results.
Fabi. Y también, if people want to ask questions in English, that's fine too.
Gracias, Ana. No quería tomar la oportunidad con
Fabi.
esta conversación sobre
No, I
las
just
aves
wanted to take advantage
residentes
of this
y
conversation
adjuntar
about
esto
resident
con
birds
la idea de
and
nuestra hoja de trabajo
connect it
colaborativa que
to
estamos
our
construyendo,
collaboration
porque una de
spreadsheet
estas
that we are
ideas
working
es
on
que
because
una de
one of the ideas, one of the tabs is about collaboration ideas. And so it's not only about information on training and funding, but also ideas. And one of the ideas that we proposed for your feedback is to do a collective work. Maybe we can start on our desks and think about how the Motus network aligns to the flyways for neotropic birds. I think that is something that we can work on to start with a baseline and then think about the further action steps. And these can help people in the neotropics to find funding, or maybe we can organize in a strategic way. I just want to take advantage to say that this is exactly the type of ideas and activities that we can do with this group.
Gracias, Fabi, por este
Thank you, Fabi.
comentario importante.
Yes, that's very important
Julián.
to mention. Julián?
Bueno, solo quería agregar que
I
en
just
este
wanted
tema
to
de los
add
residentes,
that talking about
si
resident
bien
birds,
hemos hablado mucho
if
con
we
Motus,
have
no
talked about
tocamos
Motus
el tema de cómo
a lot,
Motus se complementa
we
con otras
didn't talk about how
tecnologías para
Motus
hacer estudios a escala
complements
fina.
other
Pues nada
technologies
más quiero mencionar que
to
hay,
do
por
studies at a
ejemplo,
finer
lo que
scale.
llaman los
So,
lobos.
for
Puedes
example,
hacer
we
una,
have
una
different
cuadrícula
cores,
de unas
or
como
we have a
pequeñas estaciones
grid
Motus que se
with
comunican con la
small
misma estación
Motus
Motus
stations that
para entender el
communicate
movimiento a
with the
escala
main
fina
Motus
de aves
station
residentes
to
o de aves que están en
understand
un sitio muy determinado.
the movement at a finer
No nada más están
scale
esos, ¿no?
for
Hay
birds
otras
that are in a
tecnologías,
specific place.
y
And
pues nada
that is
más que
not the
sepan
only
que Motus
option. There are
también se
more
acopla a otras
technologies, and I
tecnologías
just
para
wanted
responder
you
diferentes
to
tipos de
know
preguntas.
that
Los que
Motus can
platicamos.
adapt or be
La cuestión
complemented
más
by
era un
other
poco general para no
technologies.
meternos en
I
detalles
think
más
that
técnicos.
this presentation
Julián,
was
vamos a
more
tener que
general, so
invitarte
we
otra
didn't
vez
go into the
porque
nitty
justo
gritty.
queremos hacer
Well,
otro
Julian, actually,
webinario sobre
we're
este
going
tema,
to
cómo
invite you again
combinar
because we do
Motus para
want to have a
cuestiones
webinar
como,
specifically on how to combine
sí, como
Motus
grandes
technology
y,
with other
sí, de
technologies
escala
to
geográfica muy
answer bigger
grandes, pero
questions
también
or to
a
work
escalas
with a bigger
locales.
geographic scale or
Y
to
me interesa mucho
focus on
este
a
tema
local
de
scale.
los,
And I am
no sé
very
si estás
interested
hablando de los
in, I don't
ETT
know if you're
nodes
talking
y no
about
sé si
ETT
ya se han
nodes.
funcionado.
I don't know
Yo
if
sé que
you've
está en una
used them, if
etapa
they worked
más o
for
menos
you.
temprana,
I
pero
know
sí,
that
sería muy
they are at
interesante tener
an early stage, but it would
otra
be
charla sobre este
definitely
tema.
very interesting to talk
Sí,
about
sí,
that.
podemos. Y, por ejemplo,
Yes,
también hay
yes,
otros
we can.
investigadores que están usando
And
las
there
mismas
are other
estaciones Motus
researchers
sin
that
los
are
nodos
using the
para
Motus
hacer
stations without the
trilateralización
knots
con las
Ujú.
antenas.
to
Pues hay
to
muchas
work only
formas
with
de
the
obtener
antennas
datos mucho más a escala fina
receptions. So there are many ways of
con Motus.
obtaining
Ujú.
finer
Incluso
data
como,
using
como mencionaron
Motus.
Paz y
And
Ernesto,
like
como
Paz and
combinar
Ernesto
Motus
mentioned,
con radiotelemetría
combining
Ujú.
como handheld.
Motus
Sí.
with other technologies.
No sé si Bianca
I don't
dice,
know, Bianca,
ajá, estaciones en bosques nubosos y montaña
saying
para estudios
stations in
vegetales.
cloud
Sí,
forests.
sería
Yes,
excelente.
and in mountains for studying quetzales.
Nos quedan unos 5 minutos.
We have about
Julie.
5 minutes. Oh, Julie.
Hi, everyone. Greetings from Central Alaska. So I think I'm about as far away from all of you. And so I want to sort of change the conversation, which I think is wonderful about looking at resident populations to kind of the opposite extreme. And it sounds like Julian and maybe others have worked with some of my colleagues in Anchorage with Motus. I've deployed Motus technology on bank swallows, and we also have some geolocator data on olive-sided flycatchers. So I'm especially interested in long-distance avian insectivore issues. And so I'm here in a new position as our statewide conservation and management coordinator, and just sort of putting myself out here because I'm really interested. I think one of our biggest issues in Alaska for migratory birds besides shorebirds is our boreal songbirds and the loss of avian insectivores. I think we are currently doing a downscaled Rosenberg et al. Analysis on our Alaska state data. And one of the important patterns that we're finding is that since the 1990s, when the breeding bird surveys began in Alaska, the most dramatic losses we've experienced are long distance populations of insectivores, especially swallows and flycatchers. So those are headed, down to Latin America. We don't know anything. We don't understand why or what's going on. Maybe it's just the most extreme stressors along the way, the farthest distance to go. We're doing some genoscape work as well. But I'll put my email in the chat, and if other people have interests in these sorts of questions, I'd like to talk to you more because we have some funding. I'll be talking with Wendy Easton more as well. I see other friends of mine from far north places here, but I think we need to start talking more about what do we do about losses of insectivores. So thanks for this wonderful forum. I've really learned a lot.
Thanks so much, Julie. I don't know if any of the presenters
Thank you so much.
have responses
I
to
don't
that, but
know
I'll just say,
if
yeah, as Fabi mentioned,
any
that's exactly
other
what we're
of the
hoping to do with
presenters
this group is
wants to
sort
say
of
anything,
provide a space to
but that's
develop these
exactly
kinds
what
of
we want to do.
collaborations across the hemisphere. And yeah, we will be sending out soon a Google spreadsheet, first for feedback about kind of the format, but ultimately we want that to be a space to basically talk about potential collaborative projects, and also funding opportunities and training opportunities. So yeah, once we send that out, please put your information and these ideas up there so we can start, actually developing these collaborations. Casi estamos a la hora de terminar. Nos quedan
Okay,
unos 2 minutos.
so
No
we
sé
have
si
2
alguien
minutes.
más
We're about
tiene
to
una última pregunta
close up,
o comentario.
to wrap up. I don't know if anybody has another question, another comment.
Okay. En el caso de que no, muchísimas gracias de nuevo
Okay,
a
so if there are no
nuestros
comments or
presentadores, a
questions,
Julián,
thank you
Ernesto y
so
Paz,
much to our speakers,
por
Julián,
estas
Ernesto, and
excelentes
Paz, for
presentaciones.
these
Yo creo que
excellent
todos aprendimos un
presentations. I think
montón
we
y
all learned
sí, el trabajo que
a
ustedes
lot,
están
and the work
realizando
that
es
you're
muy
doing
impresionante y
is
inspirador.
impressive,
Entonces,
and
muchísimas gracias por todo el trabajo
it fills us with
y por
hope.
las
Thank you so
presentaciones
much for all the work
interesantes.
that you do, for your presentations.
Y sí,
And
gracias a
yes,
todos
thank
por
you
unirse. Thank you
everyone
everyone for
for
being here.
joining.
This was wonderful. Thank you for all your questions, and we'll hopefully see you at the next one. I don't know if any of the other co-leaders have anything else to add.
Muchas gracias a todos y muchas gracias
Thank you,
a los
everyone.
presentadores.
Thank you to the
Yeah,
speakers.
thanks everyone. It's been a really great session and wonderful to see these kinds of connections emerging. That's exactly the goals of the group. So yes, thanks a lot, and hope to see you again soon.
Bye, everyone. Saludos.
See ya. Bye-bye.